What was the work routine when you were working with him?
Well, before I went there, he had just discovered, I think a year or two earlier, the magnetic effect, the chemisorption effect on magnetism.
Mhm.
He was studying nickel, heterogeneous nickel catalysts, and he found that when hydrogen was chemisorbed on nickel, then the magnetization decreased. He had just discovered that, I think, a couple of years ago. And my job was to extend this work to higher pressures. And in fact, that was quite tedious work to set up the high pressure apparatus, high pressure and low pressure combined. And in fact, I stayed there 10 months, and I built the apparatus for 9 months. So that finally we got good results, but just during 1 month, the last month. And it turned out to be, what we showed actually was that the magnetization continues to decrease when you increase the hydrogen pressure. Previously people thought that the surface is covered already at very low pressures. So that was the little extension of his previous work.
How did he interact with postdocs?
Well, he was a little peculiar person. Do you know him, or did you know him?
I only met him once or twice.
Yeah, many people thought he was sort of rather peculiar. He didn't talk to people very much, including his students. But I happened to get along very well with him. He came to lab every morning, well, for a few minutes, and asked how things are going, and so that was about it.
What interest did you have that kept you from pursuing the catalysis, or was it a lack of interest?
I would say that was purely accidental. As I mentioned, I was interested in synthetic inorganic chemistry, making compounds, and especially unusual low-valent, zero-valent compounds and so on. And as I said, we discovered this iridium compound which reacted with hydrogen normal conditions, and that had, of course, implications in catalysis. And I was fortunate to have at Mellon Institute, across the hall was the office of Keith Hall. You know him?
Yes.
Yes, he was at Mellon Institute, of course, and he was a leading man in heterogeneous catalysis. So one of the first things about our observation of this hydrogen reaction, I told him our observation, and he got all excited. And so, in fact, a lot of things I didn't know about catalysis I learned from him. So we had daily conversations just very early on. So I think that was, he definitely had an influence going into catalysis.
How would you describe your years before you left to go to Germany?
You mean in Estonia?
Yes.
Native country. Well, I left Estonia, I was 19 years old, so I just finished the secondary education. Well, this is another big problem. So I consider myself as a political refugee because we fled from the Russians, and of course we hear a lot of things about what is going on there now. And to some extent things are quite hopeful, but again, I have many friends there, and they say that in practice nothing has changed, and so we just have to wait and see what happens. So I was I didn't study any chemistry. My first chemical education was in Germany, in Göttingen, a small famous university town in West Germany. And in fact, after the war there were 5 Nobel Prize people there, all the famous names. Planck, Max Planck was there, Heisenberg was there, Otto Hahn, and organic chemist Windaus, and the X-ray man von Laue. There were 5 Nobel, they are already all old gentlemen, and I took one course from Heisenberg, which I, well, didn't understand anything, but just for the record I wanted to hear the famous man.
I'm just reading a book about him I brought with me by his wife, yes.
Yes, of course.
How would you describe him?
Well, he was, I try to think he was about 45 years old then, I believe. And as these famous scientists in early days, their lectures were not just as we do nowadays, read from the books or notes about known materials. He seemed to talk about what he thought a night before, for example. So it was all new stuff, and he made constantly mistakes. He wrote an equation and he erased it again, and maybe 3 or 4 times, showing that it was also very new to him what he was teaching to us. So that was quite a nice experience.
You didn't have any of the other 4?
Well, I listened to von Lauer. He gave a talk about history of chemistry. That was also quite interesting. And Otto Hahn, he had retired already, but I saw him sometimes in a restaurant. He had a separate table for himself, and it was sort of a student hangout, and he had in a corner a table for himself, and he went there every night and so on. I saw him from far. And also I heard Max Planck giving a public lecture. I believe he was already over 90 years old. He died, I think he was 95 or so. And it was a public lecture. He was in wheelchair, and his daughter sort of pushed the wheelchair into the auditorium, and I think the daughter was already quite old, over 70, and so